In recent days, the city of Kupiansk has once again become a flashpoint on the information front lines of the war between Russia and Ukraine. A city whose name has been spoken with triumph in Russian state media and with defiance in Kiev circles. What seemed to be yet another routine claim of liberation has unexpectedly turned into a story that shook the foundations of Russian military credibility and revived Ukraine's morale. But as always, the first impression is only part of the picture. What lies behind the loud statements, the carefully staged videos, and the sudden appearance of President Volodymyr Zelensky himself on the city's outskirts? Officially, the Russian Ministry of Defense had already declared Kupiansk fully under control. It was not just another line in a daily report. It was a symbolic victory, announced directly to President Vladimir Putin by General Colonel Sergei Kuzovlev, commander of the Western grouping of forces. With medals awarded, honors presented, and the phrase "the city is liberated" echoed across Russian television, it seemed like a done deal. Yet something was quietly off. The reports sounded too confident, too rehearsed. Even among Russian military bloggers, whispers began to appear. Cautious doubts about whether the situation was really as victorious as the official narrative claimed. Then came the moment that turned everything upside down. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky suddenly appeared on camera in Kupiansk. The video was simple, calm, almost casual. No bombastic declarations, no elaborate stagecraft, just him, standing before a familiar sign with the name of the city clearly visible. His words were measured, but the symbolism was thunderous. The leader of Ukraine, in a city that Russia had declared liberated weeks before, quietly disproved an entire propaganda narrative. And while Kiev officially refrained from mocking the event, the very existence of that video instantly went viral across Ukrainian and Western media, sparking outrage and confusion among Russian supporters online. Inside Russia's propaganda sphere, the reaction was instant and chaotic. Prominent pro-Kremlin commentators, the so-called Z-bloggers, scrambled to explain the impossible. Some claimed the video was fake, created using AI or green screen technology. Others suggested it had been recorded earlier, before the city's alleged capture. A few even admitted in cautious tones that perhaps the Russian side had been too hasty in declaring victory. One particularly frustrated military correspondent summed up the mood with bitter irony. "We reported the liberation of Kupiansk, awarded medals, and now the enemy's president walks freely there with his cameraman. What are we to call that?" For Putin's administration, the blow was not only military, but reputational. The president himself had publicly invited international journalists, even Ukrainian ones, to visit Kupiansk to verify the situation. Now Zelensky had accepted that invitation in the most devastating way possible, by going there himself. The Kremlin's credibility, already fragile after years of conflicting battlefield reports, faced a fresh wave of skepticism, even among its own loyalists. The incident became a kind of symbolic collapse, not just of the Kupiansk narrative, but of the very system that insists every setback is a victory, every failure a success. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian side seized the moment. Analysts in Kiev called Zelensky's visit a psychological counteroffensive, one aimed not only at the Russian military, but at Ukrainian citizens and Western allies. After weeks of grim news from the front, this single video shifted the mood. It showed defiance, leadership, and the refusal to bow to intimidation. In a war where perception often matters as much as territory, this was a masterstroke. But this story is far from over. Beneath the surface of outrage and propaganda, there are deeper implications about truth, control, and the fractures emerging within Russia's military and media machinery. Who misled the president? Why were premature declarations made? And what does this mean for the generals who build their careers on claiming victories that may never have happened? We'll dive deeper into those questions and uncover the full scope of the scandal in the next part. If you want to understand how one short video from a war-torn city could shake an entire state's narrative machine, stay tuned and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Part 2. The storm that erupted after Volodymyr Zelensky's sudden appearance in Kupiansk did not subside quickly. Within hours, Russian telegram channels and state-aligned commentators were consumed by confusion, anger, and disbelief. The contradictions were impossible to ignore. Just weeks earlier, General Colonel Sergei Kuzovlev had stood before President Vladimir Putin, confidently declaring that Kupiansk was completely liberated and fully under our control. Putin, satisfied, even repeated those words publicly, speaking about the city as a symbol of progress on the front lines. Now, with a few seconds of video recorded by the Ukrainian president, the entire narrative was falling apart before the eyes of millions. The Russian Ministry of Defense, caught off guard, remained silent for several hours. This silence, however, spoke louder than any statement. Pro-Kremlin bloggers tried to fill the void, each offering their own version of events. Some argued that Zelensky's footage was archival, filmed before the Russian advance. Others claimed it was produced with chroma key technology, a desperate explanation suggesting the Ukrainian leader had never been there at all. Yet, as geolocation experts, journalists, and even some Russian military analysts began to examine the video frame by frame, the truth became undeniable. The location, lighting, and details matched the current situation in Kupiansk exactly. Zelensky had indeed been there, in the same city Russia claimed to have taken, in the same area where Russian maps showed no Ukrainian presence. For many Russians who follow the war closely, the incident was not merely an embarrassment, it was a revelation. It confirmed what independent analysts had long suggested, that the Russian leadership, in its hunger for victories, often relied on exaggerated or outright false battlefield reports. Generals were rewarded not for results, but for optimism. Victory reports became a routine, a form of self-preservation within the system. When Putin asked if a city was taken, the only acceptable answer was yes. And so Kupiansk, still contested and dangerous, was declared liberated, because anything else would have been career suicide for those delivering the report. What happened next inside Russia's information sphere was nothing short of chaos. Z channels, those once loyal patriotic voices of the war narrative, began to splinter. Some, like the well-known analyst Rybar, carefully distanced themselves from official claims, writing that they had always been cautious about premature announcements. Others openly criticized the military leadership, asking how such a blatant misinformation campaign could reach the president himself. "Someone lied to Putin," one channel declared, and that lie has now become visible to the entire world. Another sarcastically wrote, "So, if Zelensky entered Kupiansk, does that mean he crossed the Russian border? Or does it mean our reports were fiction from the start?" The situation exposed the fundamental weakness of the Russian information apparatus, its dependence on illusion. The generals who reported victories to the Kremlin were the same ones who shaped media coverage, feeding journalists carefully scripted narratives about steady progress and liberated territories. But wars are not fought with words. Reality, sooner or later, breaks through the propaganda wall, and Zelensky's visit became that moment of rupture. For the first time in months, Russia's own propagandists had to confront the uncomfortable question: if Kupiansk was truly under Russian control, how did the president of Ukraine stand there freely, record a message, and leave unharmed? Within Ukraine, the moment was received with a surge of pride and relief. The symbolism was powerful. Zelensky, once again at the front, walking the same soil that Russian generals had claimed as theirs. His presence there was not just about territorial control. It was a message to his people and to Ukraine's allies abroad. It was a statement that Ukraine still holds the initiative, that morale remains unbroken, and that no claim of liberation can erase the country's will to fight. In Kiev, his visit was described as an act of strategic defiance. Western media echoed that sentiment, calling it a counter-strike in the information war, one that dismantled months of Russian messaging in a single afternoon. Inside Russia, the reaction of the state apparatus revealed the deepening paranoia within the leadership. Anonymous insiders whispered to journalists that an internal investigation might be launched, not into the military failures themselves, but into how Zelensky's visit could have been allowed to happen without interception. "How could intelligence not detect his arrival?" one commentator demanded. "Where were our reconnaissance drones? Where was the air defense?" These questions, though rhetorical, reflected a real crisis within the Russian command structure. For all the vast military resources at their disposal, the sight of Zelensky walking through a supposedly captured city was an image no amount of censorship could erase. And then came the question of accountability. Would anyone in the Russian military hierarchy face consequences for misleading the president? Speculations swirled. Some channels hinted that General Kuzovlev might be quietly dismissed. Others suggested that Valery Gerasimov, chief of the General Staff, could face pressure for his role in presenting false reports. But in a system where loyalty often outweighs truth, punishment was unlikely. Instead, the blame would probably be deflected toward intelligence officers, toward communication breakdowns, or even towards the media. The deeper issue, however, remained untouched. A culture where reality is shaped to please those in power, even at the cost of strategic clarity. In the days that followed, analysts noted that the Kupiansk episode might mark a turning point in the war's perception, not because of the city's military value, but because of its symbolic weight. It became a metaphor for the entire conflict, a battle not only for land, but for truth itself. Every false victory erodes trust. Every staged announcement chips away at legitimacy. And as Russia continues to insist that it is advancing, the world now looks at those claims with growing skepticism. Even among Russian citizens, fatigue with the endless contradictions is spreading. "They told us Kupiansk was ours," one social media user wrote. "But Zelensky walks there freely. Who should we believe now?" Meanwhile, the Ukrainian leadership understood perfectly the psychological effect of what had happened. Within hours of the video's release, Ukrainian officials and diplomats shared it across platforms, using it to reinforce a simple message: Ukraine endures, resists, and reclaims its space, even under the shadow of overwhelming force. The footage was not merely about geography, it was about perception. Every step Zelensky took near that city sign was a challenge to Russia's narrative and a reminder to the world that facts still matter, even in the fog of war. Yet the fallout inside Russia was far from over. Bloggers, commentators, and even some television pundits began to reflect, carefully, cautiously, on the widening gap between official statements and ground reality. The Kupiansk incident had exposed what many already knew but feared to say: that the Russian war machine is built not only on force, but on illusion. An illusion maintained by fear, repetition, and the suppression of inconvenient truths. And when that illusion breaks, even briefly, it shakes the system to its core. But there is more to this story, much more. The aftermath of Kupiansk rippled through diplomatic circles, military strategy discussions, and even internal Kremlin politics. Questions began to surface about the true condition of Russia's forces, about the reliability of its command, and about whether the entire information framework could withstand another blow like this. In the next part, we will explore those consequences in depth. How the scandal around Kupiansk influenced the broader balance of power, why it has become a test case for both sides, and what it reveals about the future of this long, grinding war. Stay with us, subscribe, and prepare for the full picture, because what happened after Kupiansk is even more telling than what happened there. Part 3. In the weeks following Zelensky's visit to Kupiansk, the tremors from that single appearance continued to spread through Russia's political and military establishment. The Kremlin attempted to move on, flooding the media space with new narratives about operations near Pokrovsk, about stabilization efforts along the Oskil River, about how everything is under control. Yet the shadow of Kupiansk lingered, impossible to erase. Every new briefing, every triumphant claim was now met with a silent, unspoken question from the public and even within the ranks. Is this another Kupiansk? Within military circles, trust began to erode. Officers who once repeated official talking points started whispering doubts in private. Reports emerged that Putin had demanded clear verification procedures for future battlefield updates, an implicit acknowledgement that his top generals had misled him. General Sergei Kuzovlev, who had stood in front of Putin on November 20th, declaring full control over Kupiansk, vanished from public view for several weeks. By mid-December, unofficial sources suggested he had been quietly reassigned, though the Kremlin offered no comment. The medal he had received, the Gold Star of Hero of the Russian Federation, became an uncomfortable symbol, a reminder of a victory that never truly happened. Inside the Kremlin, aides worked feverishly to contain the political fallout. Propagandists were instructed to avoid using Kupiansk's name directly, replacing it with vague phrases about territorial adjustments and local stabilization. State TV focused on other regions, broadcasting images of soldiers receiving awards, tanks moving through muddy fields, and new advances that could not be independently verified. But the internet, even under Russian censorship, had already captured the contradiction. Clips of Zelensky standing in Kupiansk circulated endlessly, spliced with earlier footage of Putin nodding approvingly as his generals reported success. The contrast was devastating. The calm Ukrainian president on the ground versus the Russian leader in a gilded hall listening to false reports. In Kiev, the strategic importance of this moment was not lost. The Ukrainian government used the Kupiansk episode to strengthen its diplomatic narrative, emphasizing transparency and truth. Foreign correspondents were invited to verify conditions in the city. The Ukrainian General Staff released limited but verifiable footage confirming ongoing operations nearby, reinforcing the perception that Ukraine controlled at least part of the area and maintained access to key supply lines. In Washington, Brussels, and London, analysts began referring to Kupiansk as a symbolic fracture in Russia's information war, a moment when propaganda met reality and reality won. For President Zelensky, the visit became one of the defining moments of his wartime leadership. Advisors close to him described the trip as calculated but deeply personal. Kupiansk was not just another frontline town. It was one of the cities that had suffered under occupation in 2022 before being liberated, only to face renewed Russian assaults. His decision to go there, to stand before the sign bearing the city's name, was both a gesture of defiance and a message to Ukrainians that their sacrifices were not forgotten. It also served as a warning to Moscow that no claim of victory would go unchallenged. Zelensky's calm demeanor in that short video, no dramatics, no slogans, just the steady tone of a man addressing his people, resonated across the world. It reminded audiences that leadership in war is not measured only by force, but by presence. Meanwhile, the Russian information environment continued to fracture. Prominent commentators like Igor Girkin, Strelkov, who had long criticized the Russian high command, seized upon the Kupiansk debacle as proof of systemic rot. This is not an isolated failure, one pro-Russian analyst wrote on Telegram. It is a reflection of how the entire military hierarchy functions. Upward reports of success, downward silence about failure. Even some of the more cautious Z channels, which previously avoided criticizing the government directly, began to express frustration. It is impossible to fight a war with illusions, one wrote. If we lie to ourselves, how can we ever win? The situation also had ripple effects on morale within the Russian army. Soldiers at the front, who had already grown skeptical of Moscow's declarations, saw Kupiansk as confirmation that the leadership's version of events often diverged sharply from reality. Leaked communications and intercepted chatter suggested that units operating near the city felt abandoned, uncertain whether reinforcements or logistical support would ever arrive. "They tell the president everything is fine," one soldier reportedly said in a recording shared online. "But we're the ones here watching the truth unfold." The dissonance between propaganda and lived experience widened the emotional distance between the Kremlin and the troops it depended upon. Internationally, Kupiansk became a case study in how modern warfare is not only fought with weapons, but with narratives. Western intelligence agencies highlighted the incident as an example of Russia's growing information vulnerability. Reports circulated in NATO briefings, noting that the credibility of Russian battlefield claims had reached its lowest point since the invasion began. Diplomats privately remarked that this loss of informational trust made negotiations even more complicated. How could one engage with a side that systematically falsified its own reports? For Ukraine, the psychological and diplomatic dividends were immense. In the weeks following the video, Western support for Kiev's cause deepened. Media coverage shifted noticeably. Rather than focusing on battlefield stalemates, outlets began emphasizing Ukrainian resilience and Russian disarray. Analysts on major networks like CNN, BBC, and France 24 discussed how one short clip from Kupiansk had exposed the hollowness of months of Russian statements. It wasn't just about who held which street. It was about who held credibility. And in that contest, Ukraine had won decisively. Inside Russia, however, the leadership tried to reclaim control over the story. By late December, state outlets began pushing a new narrative, that the Kupiansk incident was overblown, that Zelensky's visit had been a brief propaganda stunt conducted on the outskirts of the city, not in the main urban area. But even this attempt at damage control only deepened the sense of doubt. If the Russian army truly controlled the city, why would Zelensky risk appearing anywhere near it? And if he had done so safely, what did that say about the effectiveness of Russia's much-touted front lines? Gradually, the Kupiansk scandal began to intertwine with broader questions about the direction of the war itself. Analysts noted that as the Russian army pressed forward in some areas and retreated in others, Moscow's political leadership increasingly relied on grand narratives of inevitable victory to maintain domestic support. But those narratives could only survive if they remained unchallenged. Kupiansk shattered that illusion. For the first time, the Kremlin's own loyal commentators were forced to publicly acknowledge that the president might have been misled. A heresy in a system built on loyalty and control. It was not just an information failure, it was a political wound. By early 2026, the story of Kupiansk had become part of a larger pattern, a pattern of overstatement, denial, and quiet corrections. Yet, unlike other moments, this one left a visible mark. It showed that truth, even when suppressed, has a way of surfacing. It revealed the cracks in a propaganda machine that once seemed impenetrable. And it reminded the world that in the age of smartphones, satellites, and instant communication, reality cannot be fully hidden behind slogans. The irony is that Kupiansk itself, the small city on the banks of the Oskil River, has become more than a place on the map. It has become a metaphor for the struggle between illusion and fact, between power and accountability, between fear and honesty. When historians look back at this war, they may not remember every battle or every speech, but they will remember the moment when the president of Ukraine stood calmly in a city that his enemy had claimed to own, and with one simple act he dismantled months of deception. For now, the war continues. The guns have not fallen silent, and the front lines still shift. But the Kupiansk episode has already entered the collective memory of this conflict as a reminder that propaganda can win the day, but never the truth. As the world watches new offensives unfold and new announcements echo from Moscow, the question remains: how many more liberated cities exist only on paper? How many more victories are built from illusion? In the end, perhaps Kupiansk was not just about geography. It was about the boundaries between truth and fiction, and about how one quiet act of courage exposed them both.